I'm Kathryn Goldman Schuyler, and this is Exploring Leadership. I'm delighted to be here today with you, Matthew Lee. This is part of a series on leading during a time of global disruption, which we are certainly in right now. Dr. Matthew Lee is Director of Empirical Research at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. He served as chair of the American Sociological Association's section on altruism, morality, and social solidarity, and as president of the North Central Sociological Association. Matt's research explores pathways to human flourishing, benevolent service to others, and the integration of social science and the humanities. He's currently co-editing a book for Oxford University Press on the interdisciplinary measurement of well-being, something I hope we'll hear about today. And I know him as a compassionate, creative thinker. What is flourishing as you and the other members of your program work with that? And how is that important for us to be thinking about during this time of global pandemic?
The idea of flourishing is that we move beyond partial aspects of well-being, like our own individual happiness or positive affect, for example, or the profitability of our organization. That's, sort of one measure of partial well-being, to more complete understandings of whole person well-being, complete well-being, the well-being of all others, the well-being of the life-supporting systems of the world. And so flourishing in its broadest sense moves from the individual to the organization and community and up to the world. Oftentimes, we have to make trade-offs across some of these domains. So at the individual level, we might look at happiness and life satisfaction, which is commonly measured in studies of well-being, but also perhaps character and virtue, which draws more from the humanities, but maybe social scientists haven't focused on as much. Something like mental and physical health are very commonly measured, but meaning and purpose, close social relationships, those different domains, most people agree on most of the time. Most of the world's population would also add spirituality or religion as part of their understanding of well-being. That gets a little bit more complicated. So we have separate measures for spiritual well-being in our research. Most people would say that in order to sustain these domains of well-being over time, you need financial and material stability. You need to have that lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs met at some level. That may not be the goal of life. That may not be an indicator of full thriving, but you have to have that at some level, and that will vary over time. A lot of people can be quite content and flourishing in a lot of ways with not that much financial material stability.
What I think of when you say that is the questions that have been raised so much, both by sociologists and social activists, about social justice and about everybody being included. So how does that relate to how you look at flourishing?
We attend to the financial material stability present in people's lives, but we don't necessarily see that as the end goal of life. We recognize that there are great differences in terms of the life chances that people have based on their financial material stability. So it must be measured. It must be included in all of our models. But we understand that people really, what they really want from life are these other domains that are ends in themselves, and that their ability to pursue these ends are sometimes affected in interesting ways by the financial material conditions. So one of the things that we found from our cross-national studies is that oftentimes in our US samples, people have higher levels of financial material stability, but lower levels of close social relationships, and overall lower levels of flourishing. It's not like a a contest where you're just trying to accumulate as much as you can in each of these domains. Some people will trade off financial stability and even physical and mental health in order for them to realize a strong sense of purpose and meaning in life, to pursue a calling, for example. And so, we want to be aware of all of these different domains and understanding of how different groups throughout the world prioritize one or more of these domains, but see how they all fit together. So that's where we move beyond conventional understandings of wellness that are pretty limited, or conventional understandings of well-being, into this broader concept of flourishing. So we just started a research project with the city of Columbus where they've collected this instrument for the first time. The community flourishing instrument is brand new. The individual flourishing measure has been used a lot, and we've got research on that we've published.
So it's fairly new to be measuring the flourishing of communities.
Yeah, I think it's been measured in different ways, but not the way that we have understood it. And oftentimes it's been more focused on in terms of, political participation or financial, well-being, availability of education, those kinds of things, which are really important, but not as much on the subjective side of things. So what we're trying to do is bring together the individual level domains with the community domains and bring those together. So we've got this project with the city of Columbus where they've already conducted the survey. Our comparative case was supposed to be in Wuhan, China. So you can imagine that there's been some delay
wow.
on that one.
Now,
So
what led to an intent to compare Columbus and Wuhan?
Well, we were approached by folks at the Columbus Foundation with an interest in this. And I had been in conversation with the university in Wuhan to do a series of lectures. I was supposed to be leaving this Saturday, actually, to do those lectures. So that's on hold.
What got Wuhan interested in your work and in flourishing?
Well, there were a group of sociologists at a university who were studying well-being of communities in various ways and felt that their work could be enriched by more attention to some of these domains that had not been included. There's a lot of research on economic well-being and physical health, and a little bit on happiness. People will ask, are you satisfied with your life? Or are you happy most of the time, or something like that? But really digging into meaning and purpose, character and virtue, some of these community domains about, are there practices and structures in place to help people grow closer together in relationships? These kinds of things that are important to people, but haven't been the focus of a lot of government surveys or even social science research. And so
let me just pause you on that, because that's really interesting. So some places are developing, some governments are looking at processes and policies to look at social relations, and what can they do that would encourage that?
yeah, so New Zealand, for example, has attempted to link its government budgeting process to whether it promotes well-being and flourishing in these kinds of ways.
Wow.
And so I think that there's a lot of convergent thinking on this. Some cities and communities and nations have taken the lead on this. Of course, Bhutan has become somewhat famous for its focus on gross national happiness rather than gross domestic product or something like that. Columbus was in touch with the city of Santa Monica, which had taken a really strong interest in this. We know of some work in Louisville that's been framed in terms of compassion, unleashing compassion at the individual level and at the community level. So
the mayor there has been involved with that for quite a while. So
that's right.
I wonder if that's important. I know they've had consistent leadership there.
That's right.
I don't know if that's been so in the other places that have been developing of focus and
Yes.
flourishing?
Well, I think that there is convergent thinking in communities and even organizations. A lot of organizations are dissatisfied with their wellness approach. They've had kind of a narrow deficit reduction model where we're trying to reduce anxiety, or we're trying to reduce burnout, or reduce stress, or manage stress, or something like this. But I think people realize that doesn't go nearly far enough. It's not just about getting us back to what researchers call languishing. We don't have some clinical diagnosis anymore. So I think whether it's Wuhan or Columbus or New Zealand or any of these communities, and many organizations as well, that have shifted out of this model of narrow wellness and towards a broader vision of flourishing that contributes to planetary well-being. It's not just about my flourishing or about my organization's flourishing. If we are thriving at the expense of other individuals, if our organization is thriving at the expense of other organizations, if our country is thriving at the expense of other countries, we're not satisfied with that. There's something, again, what is a person? A person is ultimately a being that is dissatisfied when it's not recognizing the connection between my flourishing and other people's flourishing, between my country's flourishing and other people's flourishing.
Do you see countries that are going towards the kind of focus towards flourishing and the well-being of others being as important as our own?
What's exciting to me is to go to so many different groups and hear them talking about wanting, in the words of the Well-Being in the Nation Network, which is a group of people that have come together to try to organize more collectively outside of just their individual organizations, to begin to see ourselves as stewards of the system. And the system is either promoting the vital conditions that allow everybody to fully flourish, or we need to move in that direction. And so there are a lot of people who are looking beyond their own organization, beyond their own countries, to try to become better stewards of the system. And this is an awareness shift. There are also a lot of people who are moving in the opposite direction. So every action sort of produces a reaction. But what the COVID crisis is showing us is that, we don't have a choice except to recognize the interconnectedness that already existed, that in some ways we weren't as appreciative of, but that is increasingly going to be our reality, our shared reality. Why not begin to heal some of the disconnects within the self, between self and other, and perhaps even spiritual disconnects? And why not devote more of our attention and our action to those things? So you see, for example, greatly expanded interest in compassion, not just an individual reaching out to reduce the suffering of another individual, but compassion as a capability at the organizational level.
Do you see leaders expressing this in organizations or
Sure.
government? Where do you see it in the leadership?
Yeah, sure. So we talked about Louisville just a moment ago, and there are other cities that have signed on to this charter for compassion that was started by Karen Armstrong, and others have joined that. So I often will try to talk about leadership not in terms of who holds the position at the top of some hierarchy, but as a kind of grassroots capacity that's expanding. And so you see lots of people taking personal responsibility, not just for their own flourishing and their family and maybe their neighborhood, but for the flourishing of all others without exception, and wanting to devote their organization's resources not just to pleasing shareholders or even stakeholders, but to work towards creating kind of a healing presence in the world.
I know you do empirical research. Have you done any case studies? Do you have any stories that you can tell us about this?
When we've done work with organizations, I can just tell you something very briefly. We will talk with employees of organizations, and you'll find that the compassionate leaders are often not the ones at the top of the hierarchy, but there's something really wonderful happening with mid-level managers or workers who don't have a formal leadership title, but they're very effective and thoughtful in doing something that contributes to the financial bottom line of the organization in ways that are not fully appreciated. So this speaks to the financial bottom line and sustainability of the organization, the effectiveness of the organization, but it's also what makes people want to come to work. So one graduate student in behavioral, I think it was counseling actually, was recounting her experience at a school where she was doing some teaching. And at the beginning of every day, they got together with their department and they just checked in with each other and expressed deep care and concern for each other. And she'd never seen anything like that in any other organization. And she said it was just magic. It didn't pay well, and she moved on and got an advanced degree and moved into the field of counseling. But she's never been able to replicate that magic that she experienced. And so it
I
was
wonder
just
why. Since she experienced it, I wonder what made it hard for her to try that in other places.
it's a collective dynamic. And if you try, there's this other great book, Reinventing Organizations, talking about how some organizations are really in an innovative way organized around wholeness and self-management and autonomy and all of these great things. And other organizations are just not organized that way. So if you try to shift the culture by yourself, you hit the brick wall. And
I'd love to find out what got you interested in flourishing. There you were practicing sociology. How did you get to become absorbed with this and focus on it for your career?
well, I can't take that much credit. It's all grace at the end of the day. I was a criminologist originally by training. Within the field of criminology, there was this notion that immigration was going to socially disorganize communities. And we found that, in fact, immigration actually revitalized communities. It contributed to these vital conditions that flourishing scholars now study. Really strong social relationships there, lots of compassion. And you didn't hear any of this in criminology or in the news media or
How
anything else.
interesting.
Yeah, and so we actually coined the term immigration revitalization perspective to contrast with social disorganization, and that was sort of my first experience with looking at the bright side, not just at the dark side. So you're familiar, I'm sure, with appreciative inquiry as a method for transforming organizations. So you don't go in and problem solve and ask people what's wrong. You notice what's right and you build on that. And so we started noticing what was right in immigrant communities and talking about how it actually suppressed crime. It didn't increase crime the way social disorganization theory.
Well, if you think of right now, too, what's been going on in the last few years in the discussion of immigration, it seems like people haven't discovered that yet. You're saying you discovered it and that it's in the research for 20 years, but it's not out there in everybody's minds.
I think this is a question of awareness. Are we prepared to notice when something's going right? And so, the next opportunity I had, again, I take no credit for it, it's all grace, as I said, was a project looking at religiously inspired benevolent service. A colleague across the hall of mine had a long-standing interest in religious experience, and I had some interest in altruism, and we started talking. And long story short, we studied people who follow a calling to engage in benevolent service, and a lot of these folks persist when others pull out. So the professionals or the experts or the people who are getting paid pull out of some dangerous part of the world, and these folks stay with it. And so we quickly understood that it was because they had a strong experience of existential well-being, which is basically one of our domains, meaning and purpose. They had such a high level of meaning and purpose, they were willing to trade off happiness or material stability or physical health, often in quite significant ways. Then there was this opportunity to work with the Human Flourishing Program that really puts it all together. And so social connections, that's one of the domains we study. Existential well-being, meaning and purpose, that's one of the domains, but so much else. And really what was so exciting to me was the way that the director of the program had been so committed to integrating wisdom from the humanities, philosophy and theology, with social science. And I had felt up to that point that a lot of the well-being research was maybe a little bit shallow. It wasn't delving into character and virtue. It wasn't delving into things like sacrifice as much, focusing more on hedonistic happiness, pleasure, those kinds of things.
It seems to me that that goes back to some of the founding questions in the field of sociology and
Right.
also in programs at Harvard. Didn't
Right.
Harvard start before most other universities with a very multidisciplinary approach to the social sciences?
Of course, the founder of the Department of Sociology at Harvard, Pitirim Sorokin, founded an institute on altruism and really
Right.
was drawing upon philosophy and religious studies and other things as he tried to make sense of this very interesting and important topic. And so, we have tried to stay very engaged with the collective wisdom of the humanities, while still trying to do rigorous cutting edge causal modeling with longitudinal data sets and really as much as we can bring together the best of social science with the best of the humanities. And
So it would seem to me that some discussion and communication between people looking at purpose in the context of leadership studies for leaders and how important that is and the work that you're doing might really be valuable both ways.
there again, I think there's so much convergent thinking, which is why I think it's inevitable that we will make progress. We'll have the pushback, and we're seeing that. But in the long run, I think Martin Luther King Jr. and others were right that the arc of the universe bends towards justice. If you focus on compassion that's effective in alleviating suffering, you light up the reward centers of the brain. If you focus on empathy, where you're just feeling other people's pain, you're lighting up the pain center in the brain. And so there's a real convergence now, I think, in recognizing, even in the field of education, like you mentioned with purpose, if we give students a sense of purpose, they enjoy studying math more. They do better at it. And so there's been, psychologists have conducted experiments where just a little bit of priming. Think about, some issue you care about and that you want to contribute to make the world a better place. You give students that and they do better at math and their grades improve. So there's a lot of convergent thinking about how do we engage the reward centers of the brain? How do we inspire people to want to become part of the solution, as opposed to some of the old way of understanding what a person is, which is that we have to motivate you with money, or we have to command you to do something. People want to grow as human beings. They want to become more virtuous. We have social structures that encourage people to be distracted from that task.
During this time of pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
everybody is focusing on the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone is focusing on the suffering
Mhm.
of people who have died or people who
Mhm.
have the illness. So the media is very much focusing our
Mhm.
minds in that direction. What
Mhm.
I've been wondering is what is the importance of bringing in the possibility of policymaking in relation to
Mhm.
flourishing
Mhm.
while we emerge from this? Clearly, there has to be new policy.
Right.
Are people thinking about that? Are there discussions of that in your program?
Yes, that's a good question. I think what people will realize as this pandemic drags on is that some of the um, habits that they thought contributed to their happiness maybe are not as essential as they thought. But now we're at a moment that if we do have this greater awareness, we might come to prioritize um, other aspects of our well being besides the financial and material stability. And I don't want to minimize the equity and justice part when I say that, but I do think that collectively we might have the possibility of waking up to the idea that this extreme inequality that we've had is just not all that helpful.
That it doesn't help either the individuals flourish or the communities or the society, I hear you saying.
Despite increasing prosperity for a long time now, the increasing deaths of despair, increasing youth anxiety and depression and suicide, on and on and on, these kinds of problems um, are a signal. And so we can begin, again, I think it's helpful to think in terms of flourishing, to put all of these together, to synthesize all of the signals that we're getting, and to begin to really explore the extent to which we have prioritized things in our culture that are most conducive to our deepest flourishing. And you know, maybe there's been some coping mechanisms that are temporarily pleasing, but in the long run are bad for us and for the world.
That's a really big statement
Well, I've been
that
talking
we
with,
have developed as a society coping mechanisms that don't help us, that don't help us flourish.
you know, I think that there's an opportunity here for us to understand, as some of my colleagues at Harvard have done research on this, that a lot of our leisure activities are non-restorative. They're actually harmful for us. So I'm smiling at the moment because I'm thinking about how the state of Florida declared scripted professional wrestling as an essential business so that they can continue to have this form of entertainment for people or something. We will we will quickly realize that that's actually not essential, and that a lot of the um, resources that we've and not just financial, but in terms of time, which is the most precious commodity, but a lot of the resources that we've devoted to some of these forms of non-restorative leisure are contributing to our lack of individual and collective flourishing. There's colleagues at McLean Hospital here who have, I think they're on the right track. If you start to look at all of the self-injury mortality, it's not just deaths of despair, but all kinds of other things that don't get coded as as being reflective of the same underlying conditions. If you start to put these together, it really looks like a much bigger problem. People are very concerned about opioid overdoses, and rightly so, but that's just part of it. If you look at all of the forms of self-injury mortality that have the same root causes, it's a really big problem. And we can begin to see this more clearly and see how our taken for granted habits, and including this non-restorative leisure, are feeding right into this. So we have a moment to wake up. We can't go to the big time football game anymore. We have to deal with, this is who I am, and I'm in relationship with you, and now
And here we are.
we're forced to face each other without all the escapism.
Is there anything else you'd like to leave us thinking about those links between individual and community and societal flourishing?
I think the real exciting shift is in the direction of planetary well-being, where there's no such thing as an externality. If I'm a leader of an organization, I can't say, let's create this problem for some other community to deal with. Let's pollute the environment that we all need. That moving beyond the notion of externalities, I think, is really critical to understanding how we can promote flourishing for all people without exception and for the life-sustaining systems that support our world. So that's where the excitement is for me. Even 10 years ago, you didn't have nearly as much conversation about how we can all become stewards of the systems that produce these outcomes that we want and what our role is. Even if I'm not a leader of an organization, I'm a leader in the world.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you today, Matt Lee.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.